I hope he is. And let's see. View on YouTube. All right. We have people in chat. Things appear to be working. All righty. So I suppose we will get started. And hopefully by the time I am done with these intro announcements, our speaker shows up. Otherwise, I may have to rehash the presentation I gave a while back on the same thing. Anyway, welcome to Merge PHP. We are a bunch of meetups across North America that have kind of combined forces to make sure that there's a reasonably consistent schedule for PHP content online wherever you might be. If you're looking for PHP stuff, this is the right place. And I'm going to swap from camera to slides to walk through the rest of information about us before introducing both our speaker for this time and our one for December. Okay, there we go. So we have a bunch of logos here. Atlanta, Vancouver, Seattle, Kansas City, Utah, Portland, San Diego, Austin, Vegas, and Boston are all represented with some of the organizers here on screen. And usually we will have a JetBrains license to raffle off. First email to chris@atlantaphp.org will get a license for, if you already have PHP Storm but don't have one of the other JetBrains products, you're still eligible to throw your email in here. We, depending on how many people email, might have more than one license to give away. So as a reminder, PHP, we now have 2 years of security updates, in addition to the 2 years of more active support. So the current available versions of PHP that are being supported are 8.1, 8.2, and 8.3. And of those, 8.1 is in security fix only mode. 8.2 is headed there pretty quickly. 8.3 will be active support for another year. And, well, as y'all know, given that you probably read the abstract for this meetup, 8.4 will be coming out later on this month. So there's not a massive hurry to get off of a version of PHP that's about to be end of life. But if you're on 8.0 or before, then hopefully your OS distro is doing security updates, because PHP core is not. Or you can spend money on Zend and they'll backport security fixes to older versions as well. So there are a fair number of conferences coming up. The only one here in the US is PHP Tech in Chicago. There should be more later on in the year. There's also Confu, which is a polyglot conference in Montreal if you want to swing up to Canada. yeah, IPC, Better Code, SymphonyCon, Symphony Online, a bunch of online conferences. PHP UK is a single-day conference this year, a little bit different than usual. Dutch PHP conference is back in person for, I believe, the second year now. PHP Tech, this will be their third year post-COVID coming back. And so that's that. We are on various social networks, whether that is YouTube, where you're watching us right now, Mastodon, or the Fediverse in general. So if you want to follow us from Threads, you should be able to just fine. As well as the platform that I'm going to keep calling Twitter. So before we hop in, and I might have to stall here. We'll see. The meetup topic for next month, which will be December 12th, is around AI. This is going to be an extra treat. This was originally slated to be a presentation at Cascadia PHP, which was a few weeks back. Due to Eric being under the weather, this has transitioned to being an online presentation. And that'll be coming up on December 12th. Continuing the stalling. With new advances in machine learning, advanced integrations with AI platforms are now available to everyone. You can easily build AI into your application without a PhD or advanced knowledge of linear algebra or the algorithms that make machine learning work. In this talk, we'll cover some simple integrations with commonly available tools to make your application truly smart. No prior experience in machine learning is required. Just come prepared to learn, ask questions, and get your hands dirty with state-of-the-art tools. I'm going to take a couple minutes and I actually did a sneak preview of PHP 8.4 back a few months ago. So I'll probably pull those up for the time being, and if that steps over some of what Tim was going to present, then it is his fault. All I needed to do was threaten Tim with taking over his presentation, and looks like he'll be on shortly. Also, while we're waiting, oh, hey, Tim. If you have talk ideas, then you can submit that via forum, or you can contact us on socials. And with that, Tim, come on up on stage. I think you can. Here, I'll just add you. There you are. And I'm going to stop my screen sharing and allow you to start. Assuming that you have audio.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Cool. All right, let me know when you can see some slides.
I can throw those slides on there. All right, we're good.
All right, so apologies for the tardiness. It is still the middle of the workday on the West Coast, so but here we are. So we're going to take a look at what's new in PHP 8.4. So here we are in the process right now. As you can see, three of the release candidates and/or betas, alphas were swapped out. We'll talk about that a little bit more at the end, but release candidate number 4 is currently out in the wild and available for you to test with. And on November 21st, we expect general availability, presuming that there are no showstopper bugs found or not able to be fixed by the 21st. So yay for November 21st when the new version comes out. So these are going to be ordered more or less in the order in which I find them exciting. So the very first thing is something that I was very confused about since the first time I had used it. The ability to invoke a method on a new instance of a class without using parentheses. So prior to 8.4, if you wanted to call a method on, say, like a new datetime immutable, you had to wrap the constructor inside parentheses, and then you could call the method on it. Whereas now you can just chain them through there. The RFC itself never really explained why this was ever a thing. Clearly, it was something to do with the internal lexer of the language and how it was able to parse things. Definitely on the RFC, there was some discussion about how the order looks on this, and that in this case, it's not really clear what's being called first. According to some people, I don't know. I know other languages allow this syntax, so I don't find it to be too jarring in there, but that could be one of the reasons why it's in there. But the fact that I can no longer have to type those parentheses that I always felt was unnecessary is a huge boon to me. And I know as soon as I upgrade a bunch of my stuff to 8.4, I'm going to going through and removing all those parentheses because I find them kind of annoying. So yeah, that's definitely my favorite feature of this release. But there's a lot more to come. There's some new functions around arrays. I think a lot of these were heavily influenced by stuff that I see in TypeScript, or at least I think that because I also write a bunch of TypeScript on a day-to-day basis. So in this case, we're looking at this function called array find, and it's going to return the first element in the array that matches the particular callback. So in this case, we're just looking for the first element in the array that begins with the value C. Now, in this case, our array happens to be an array of strings, but we could actually use this on an array of really anything so long as our callback function is able to properly parse that. So maybe it's an array of objects and you want to call a particular method on all those, you can also do that in there. And like I said, this is array find and not array filter. So this is going to get you the first element that it finds in that particular array. So like I said, that's array find. First element satisfies the callback function. It returns that element itself. There's also the related array find key, which gives you the key of the first element that satisfied whatever your callback function is. And then two others, which I think are more closer to what I remember in TypeScript, are the array any, and it just checks to see if any element satisfies your callback. So you might use that for an example, determine if any of the values in an array of integer are even. And you can it will stop searching the array on the first one that it finds and just return true for the function. And similarly, there's array all, which will go through and check all of the methods in there. I think this is close to the TypeScript sum function, and such that if it finds something in the array where the callback returns false, it's going to go ahead and stop searching the array and just return false for you. So yeah, some pretty cool functions there. All of this, of course, was available in userland, but you just have to go through and write some for eaches and store things in a temporary variable. And this just makes some easier code in there and probably ever so slightly more performant just because it's done in C instead of in PHP. Asymmetric visibility. This is an interesting one that I think is kind of a replacement for read-only properties, and that it's they can kind of act like internally writable properties. So in this example here, we have this class that's just holds a simple string PHP version. So when we call that constructor, we can then go ahead and modify that particular variable, read it and write it from outside the class with no particular problems. We could possibly change this to read only, but that would mean that if we needed to change the value of this variable from inside the class, you wouldn't actually be able to do so. So what we have now is this new syntax here where we can see that the variable is declared as public, but private for setting. And this allows us to then change it inside the class, but if we tried to change it from outside the class, we're going to get a visibility error. That's thrown just like any other kind of exception. This is really probably something you would change inside your, it would be something you would notice during development and change inside your code, and probably not something that would ever get shown to end users, kind of like a logic exception. So yeah, I think this allows us to kind of do a sort of the equivalent of a read-only for external and writable on internal, so that variables can be changed as needed in there, so that these things can be used on, I wouldn't necessarily on a immutable value object, but things that might need to change on there. Next, we have this deprecated attribute. So previously in your PHP code, if you had something that was deprecated, you were pretty much limited to either comments or docbox, and you would kind of have to hope that whoever is consuming your code would know that that particular thing in there. So when you call it, you don't actually see anything in there or know that it's deprecated in any way. Now we have this attribute that's actually built into PHP, taking a message and a since parameter. And now when someone calls that particular method, they will see in their error logs that the deprecated notice is in there. Now, of course, if their error logging level is set to hide deprecations, they're still not going to see it, but that would have been a choice that they would have made to kind of hide things that are kind of important anyways. Sometimes you might want to turn that off in production just if you're getting a lot of log spam, but definitely in development, something you want to keep on so that you can see what's in there. So yeah, something good. And also, I think this helps with some static analysis, and that they don't have to go through and try and parse comments before functions in there, because there actually is a new method in the PHP reflection class where you can determine if this method has this deprecated attribute on there, and then you can programmatically detect in your analysis tool whether or not you're calling any deprecated functions that have had this deprecated attribute applied to them. So pretty nifty there. Next, we're going to take a look at property hooks. And I've got a little bit of this code blanked out just so we can kind of get ourselves a boundary of here. So that's a little bit misaligned compared to how it was seeing in the preview there. But let's just assume that we have these two public strings, language code and country code, on this class called locale. And this class also has a constructor which takes each of those strings individually. When you call it, both of them are required, and they will obviously set them on there. With new property hooks, what we can do is we can come up with, say, a method here to, or sorry, these are kind of like callbacks for both the getting and the setting of the properties themselves. These are not actually function calls, but these are the properties themselves. So if we take a look at the getter for this property called combined code, it actually returns the value of the sprintf function, putting an underscore in between the two strings they are concatenated. The setter, of course, will take that one string in there, and it will find the particular underscore that's in there, explode that in there, and put those two things in there. So that means that when we call this, we can dump out the particular country code there. We can see that it's just the first part before the underscore and the last part after that too. But if we wanted to set that in there, we could call it in a different way than we had called the constructor there. We could call the combined code with pt underscore br, and it would then set both of those properties individually. So this in here is kind of trying to clean up a lot of the boilerplate code that you might have to write with the setters and getters. I'm still on the fence on this because it seems to me like about the same amount of code, but you don't have to write the literal word function. A decent editor can kind of help, autocomplete some of that or generate the code for you. So I don't know how much I really like this. It's just a different way of expressing the same thing. So maybe it'll grow on me, but for now, this seems like something that we didn't necessarily ask for, but we're getting because other languages definitely have this sort of syntax. Next, the implicit nullable types feature has been deprecated. So right now, you can set a method's class or a method's variable to have a default of null, but we also note that on this particular thing, that the actual variable is not nullable. So the fact that you can pass null into a parameter that does not accept nulls, it has to be an instance of this book object, is a little bit strange. And so if you try and call this in PHP 8.4, you're going to see that deprecated notice in your error logs. The workaround, of course, would be to make this object nullable, as we see in the second example there, or to not mark that as null, since it does not actually allow a null in there. So whenever it happens to come out, this functionality will be removed in PHP 9, and that first example would probably be a compile time error because it's not going to allow you to pass null for something that isn't nullable. Next, we have some PDO-specific driver classes. So right now, depending on what type of instance of or what type of database you connect to when you use PDO, it's going to return the same PDO object. So depending on it doesn't actually matter if it's connecting to, say, a SQLite database or a MySQL database, it's both going to be a PDO object. Starting in 8.4, it will actually be an instance of a PDO/MySQL or PDO/SQLite or whatever other instances that PDO supports. So this would mean, for example, that you can actually determine just by doing an instance of whether or not something is running on MySQL or SQLite. But because both of those are still inheriting from PDO, it shouldn't really affect any of your code going forward because all the type pending is still going to be the same. It also means that some of the more driver-specific functions like SQLite create function, which don't exist on the MySQL driver, they won't actually exist on that class anymore. So you'll be seeing a fatal error if you try and call a method that doesn't actually exist. So I think that's pretty cool in there that we can kind of differentiate those. I think these are subclasses of PDO just to try and preserve some backwards compatibility, whereas if we were trying to write this today, we probably would have called it like PDO MySQL or MySQL_PDO or something. Next, we have lazy objects. This is something I don't necessarily see you writing a whole lot in userland code. This is something I see more in frameworks. For example, a lot of dependency injection stuff will use lazy proxies in order to not have to actually instantiate your various dependencies in order to instantiate a class until they're actually used. Some ORMs use it too, where if you're, for example, trying to retrieve something on a condition of a join, but the actual data wasn't fetched in the initial query, it might return a proxy to that object. And only when you execute that call to get that joined data does it actually round trip to the database and go back and get it. So I haven't looked at any of the actual internals of how any of these work, but apparently it is a rather difficult problem to get around and can consume a fair number of unneeded CPU cycles in memory just to be able to get the lazy proxies working. But now this is built in. This is a very abbreviated example of what is shown in the example of the RFCs here. So if that is something that you're interested in, I would definitely recommend either looking at the RFC or the new manual entries for this. But the fact that these are actually done at the language level and the PHP internal engine will keep track of whether or not the proxy has been fetched or not should be a bit of a performance boost for any frameworks or packages that can take advantage of this. Another interesting thing that was in the change law is that you can no longer, or you will soon no longer be able to use an underscore as the name of your class. Right now this is valid, but soon it will not be valid. I believe that anything else that just begins with an underscore is still going to be allowed. So if you had, for example, underscore PDO, that would still be allowed, but just an underscore itself is deprecated. And who knows at what point this is scheduled for removal. The exit thing that we usually call a function has long actually been a language construct in PHP. And while that sounds like it's just kind of picking nits, this is actually has some definite differences in the way it is used. Language constructs can be called, but they can't be used like callables or used as a callback function. I don't know of this being quite as useful for something like array filter. I don't know why you'd ever want to pass exit in there as a callback, but I'm sure there are some cases where you would want to use that as a callback thing. So these now behave more like functions, although reading the RFC, it wasn't clear on whether or not they actually are functions or they still are language constructs which are able to be used as callables. But this also means that because they behave like functions, that the strict types declare statement that you have at the top is going to be in effect. So like anything else, they're going to perform type coercions. So for example, if you passed a something that is stringable into something that requests a string, it will actually call that toString method for you. And it also means that you can't pass an invalid type to these, because that would result in a type error. So these are defined such that they take either an integer or a string and not anything else. So you might, for example, want to pass an actual simple XML element that might have some error messaging in there. That's not going to be allowed. You would have to explicitly cast that to a string, so long as you're using strict types enabled. Die, I just want to mention that this isn't new, but die is just an alias to exit, and that they don't have any actual difference. Exit is the actual language construct or function, depending on how we're defining these. We have some new functions to BC math, or the methods that will take integers or float values that are larger than are technically possible within the current build limit of your PHP build. So there are constants in there called PHP int max, PHP int min, that determine the largest practical integer that you can use in that particular thing, which is going to be dependent on the build architecture you use. So if you're using a 32-bit build versus a 64-bit build, the latter has a maximum value that is twice as large. But if you're going to be regularly dealing with numbers that are close to or exceeding that, definitely the BC math extension is something you'll want to leverage. And these have functions in there like BC add, BC divide. And now they have these new 4 functions here for ceiling, division modulus, floor, and round. So you can now work with those large numbers. These work pretty much the same as you would see with the non-BC versions, calling ceil or round or something like that, but these are safe for using with those large numbers. The numbers do get treated as strings and not integers or floats or whatever, so that is something to be aware of when using BC math. We also have some new multi-byte functions. So in a world where we're now using character sets other than just plain old ASCII, and we have something like UTF-8, we were missing these other functions in here, like the various functions of trim and uppercase first or lowercase first. So now these are multi-byte safe and safe for you to use on your non-ASCII strings. Not much to see there, but it's nice that we have them finally. There are some new XML functions. I can't recall myself ever having used any of these in there, so I didn't see a whole lot of documentation on there. Some of the documentation still is incomplete because the version is not yet released. But if you are using the XML reader or XML writer and you are calling those from streams or URIs or strings, now there are these handy new functions in there. 2 new header functions. I don't have examples for these in here yet, but currently if you were using the built-in function for getting headers, this was able to, or you are now able to call these methods for getting the response headers in there. I believe how this works is if you call the internal PHP header function and you weren't sure if you had already set something, now you can get the list of headers that were already set, or if you need to, for some whatever reason, clear the response headers that are already in there, you can do that. If you are already using something like your own PSR7 implementation, it probably had this built into there, but it was the same kind of thing. It wasn't until you actually sent that out to the browser that it would actually do those, so it just kind of provided some wrapper functions around that, and it wasn't actually calling header until that response was actually written. So this is for cases outside of that. Now you can do that yourself. Request parse body. I put this last not because I think the function is unuseful, but because I am not particularly fond of its implementation. So right now, if you were to send a put request into PHP and you were to try and get the post body or the files of that, you would not actually be able to find them because it doesn't actually parse a put request by default. So instead, you call this new function called request parse body, which takes an optional array of options and returns back an array of 2 things. Now, the options that are in there can be an array of any of those 5 keys there. And these are identical to the INI settings that are already built into PHP. So if you have those set, it will read from those. Otherwise, it'll read the defaults from php.ini. And you can then override this per call of this function. So for example, you might have the max input vars set to something like 128 globally, But if you know that on this one particular place where you're using it in your code that you need to have more than that, you can just override it for this one function here and not actually have to modify the global PHP state. It then returns an array of two different items, which are meant to override the super globals of $_post and $_files. I do not like this because, one, it returns an array and you have to know the order of the fields, which means looking up the documentation every time you use it. And second, because we're passing an array of options. I feel like array options died a death when we introduced name parameters, and we should not have array options anywhere in code ever, because we can now just put these as simple parameters in there, make them all nullable, and pass in the particular values that you want. You can still use an array if you really, really wanted to with the spot operator. But yeah, good function to be able to natively grab stuff out of the put header, but implementation I am not particularly fond of. But again, if you're using some implementation of PSR7, that's probably going to be built into that package itself. And all that will mean is that they will be able to leverage this function instead of a bunch of parsing code in there, which should mean a moderate speed boost in those methods. So like I mentioned at the beginning, we are very, very close to the release date for this. And I wanted to point out that even though it's not specific to any particular PHP version yet, we have had a change in here in that the way that our releases are declared end of life. So we can see that previously we used to have a 1-year security maintenance window at the end of every release, and that has now been changed to a 2-year security window at the end of every release. So that took effect as soon as that RFC was approved, which was early this year. And also it means that the security releases are good through the end of the year instead of 2 years after the release. So while previously 8.0 ended its security maintenance window in like November 20-something of 2023, which is 3 years after 8.0 was released, we now go to December 31st of that year. So that means that when 8.4 comes out later this month or early next month, depending on what that is, that means that you will be able to run that in production and ensure that you have security support until 31st of December of 2028. Also in that change there are new features that don't require an RFC are allowed during that beta period that are in there. If there were any new features that were going to be going in, it was explicitly not allowed to be in the release candidate and bug fix releases. This has always been kind of a gray area in the previous processes. So this has solidified whether or not new features are ever allowed in that. I think that was kind of, if we might have these new features that are easier to backport into earlier versions, whether or not that would actually happen. This has just codified that no, those are not going to happen. It reduces the number of release candidates from 6 to 4. So that means that the developers have just that little bit more time until they start cutting that first beta, because those second release candidates are no longer part of the process. Like I mentioned, we extend security support by 1 year and also end on the end of the year instead of that. So that does mean that if, for example, one of these releases that's out in the wild, if the core team decided they wanted to increase its either active maintenance window or security support window, that would mean, even if they were only to extend that by 1 day, it would actually effectively extend the total lifetime of that version by 1 year, because the security support window always ends on the last day of the year. But this, contrary to bullet 2, this kind of allows them to fix recent regression fixes during security support. So if you're wondering how you might be able to play with it now, probably the easiest way is going to be running a Docker container. You can simply use the 8.4.0 RC3 tag in there to be able to run your script. If you want an interactive command line, you can run that first command there. Otherwise, you can run a particular script one at a time and see if you have any compatibility issues or new deprecations by running one of those middle ones. If you have a Docker file that already exists in there, you can just simply upgrade that to your PHP 4.0 RC3. That's all the slides I have. I think we went through that pretty quick. Go ahead and bring the other presenters back up and see if anyone has any questions. Anyone? Have I just been presenting to a blank wall this whole time? Okay, I see in the chat that they are there, and someone needs to let us in.
Look, I'm here.
Hey, is that Alina?
Yeah, add people.
It seems like we're all using the same 2FA codes at the same time. I'm getting ones that are expired.
That's the whole thing. So everybody tried to jump in. Whoever got it, I was there first. Ah, I made it work.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, what is everyone else's thoughts? What is your favorite of all the stuff that we saw?
I actually am pretty excited that they have just solidified a little bit more about what the release schedules and things. It's always nice to be able to be, know when your security is going to be end of life and know when the next ones are going to come out and just say no when people want to add more things. So.
And I didn't quite follow with the being able to add features while it's still in beta. Like, is that the opportunity to sneak in features without having to go through a formal RFC process? You're on mute.
Unmute. There we go. Oh, I can't unmute.
Sorry, I did not realize I was muted. Let's try that again. Features that already did not require an RFC are allowed to be added in the beta period. So I would have to go back and look at one of the existing documents that define what does and doesn't require an RFC. I know if it's changing like the construct or syntax of the language itself, that definitely would require an RFC. But there are some things that don't, because if you look at the number of pull requests to the PHP core and you exclude bug fixes, there are certainly more there than there are RFCs on the wiki. But yeah, Eric, didn't you recently talk about new features in PHP? Is there anything I missed that you had in your slides?
No, because I didn't talk about these.
Okay.
I was talking about PHP 9.
Okay.
Well, I'm excited about the property hook. The property hooks RFC, and not having to, like, so much of our boilerplate whenever we create a property is creating a setter and getter for it, and the setter is just take this, stick it over here. We're not doing much with it at all, and so for those pieces, there's no more need to create that boilerplate setter.
Okay, so just curious, have any of those cases been solved by read-only properties?
Well, considering I haven't used read-only properties yet because we're still on PHP 8.1. I don't know.
Okay. 8.1 isn't the worst answer. But yeah, I was hoping you could win me over with property hooks.
Okay.
But yeah, it sounds like there's some investigation to be done. I think the asymmetric visibility will solve some of the problems that you would otherwise have going to read-only properties.
Mhm.
So it could be a mix of the three.
Yeah.
All right, Mark, Chris, your thoughts now?
I do enjoy the no parentheses. I knew you had that as your first one. I'm also with Eric on the property hooks. There was a huge discussion in internals leading up to it. The RFC was went through a lot of rounds of discussion. It was interesting to watch it evolve and see the examples of the use cases. So I think it has its use. It's definitely kind of a nice to have, not a must have, but it can do some cleanup on the code, especially on your more entity type or model typed classes.
So can you think of anywhere in any of your code where as soon as you upgrade the project, you're going to go through and rewrite those classes, or maybe some new classes that you think, oh, as soon as we get down on 8.4, I'm going to start writing that?
Yeah, I definitely can see some of the classes we're using where we would start using that instead of the way we're doing it. Kind of like Eric was mentioning, like we have the getters and sitters right now. We'll move it over and put that with read-only properties and things. So that'll clean things up a bit, shorten them up a little bit, not significantly, but some. Yeah, like I see still needing some for some validation, like the actual setters and stuff. We need to do some more content checking. Where it's not just gonna be a simple one-liner. You're muted if you're talking.
I'll show the example one more time here, but I also feel like, are you able to see that now? Yes, no, maybe so.
Nope,
Okay,
not seeing it.
let's try that one more time. The permissions dialog is not popping up, and I don't know why. All right, then I'll just mime it. So you have of course, the class level declaration is going to be at your level 0 indent, and then your properties are 1 indented level, and then you have the getter itself, which is at level 2. So that means your code can't start till level 3. So it's kind of like really deeply nested code, and that you're going to have like a ton of blank space to the left of whatever you put in there. So I feel like it's going to be useful for really easy stuff, but if it's going to be a hard method just because it looks like it's so far into the right, I would want to just have a get foo or whatever method in there instead of these property hooks. But I think that also depends on how they're going to be consumed too. But it does mean now that you can write some actual code behind a particular property and not have to use the magic underscore get or underscore set in there. And so those can be on one particular thing and not your entire class. You don't have to have that catch-all condition at the beginning of your magic method. So maybe there is that. So yes, thank you for the merged PHP therapy team for enlightening me.
I personally have never been a fan of the magic getters and setters, and so I do like this solution instead.
I think the problem with magic is that you don't know how it works, and it's just magic, and then you end up messing things up because you think it's doing something when it's not. So it's nice to be a little bit more specific, which is why I like strict types. It makes it a little bit easier when you're working with multiple people to be able to know what's going on. And it's the same, I think magic methods are very much like that. It's like, oh, well, I'm just going to trust that other developer did it the same way I would have done it, and it's just going to work. And oh, look, it gave me a string this time. Well, maybe it could give you an array next time, though. So if we don't have those things, I don't think magic methods were necessarily that bad, but I do like more strictly enforced code base. Makes it easier when you're working with people. Hey, if you're doing it on your own, go ahead and write whatever you want. But if you got to work with other people,
Code should
it's really
first
nice
be
to have some
readable by a
standards.
human being, and then some standards, and then secondly by the computer. So,
Right.
agreed.
Yeah. Although, isn't everything magic until you understand how it works?
Exactly.
Like,
But it's a lot harder to understand how it works.
Yeah, I know on one project that I worked on, when we introduced a dependency injection container that had auto wiring, and it's like, you don't have to write, the constructor for this and pass in all these parameters. You just put them in there, and the container knows where to find them. And there's kind of like, that's a lot of magic. I'm like, yeah, but it saves us so much boilerplate.
Yeah.
I think the problem with magic is it makes it harder to learn a code base. If things are explicitly called, you can look at the code and understand exactly what's going on. So that's why I still lean towards non-magical things in code.
Let's see. I'm looking at the comments here. Josh wanted to see a practical example of array all. I don't know, but anytime you want to make sure that everything in an array has some sort of aspect, that would be a case of it. I can see maybe more the opposite. You want to see if something, you can find a reason why you don't want it. Maybe you have, no, the example I just thought would have been solved by array filter. All right, that's a good question, Josh, and someone will come back to you on that.
I think you could, like, if you're just trying to find out if this matches, like you were saying, yeah, you can do some of that with array filter, but if all you're trying to do is say, hey, does this meet the requirements, whatever those are, you can do it a lot more so like you were. Now, if you're using some sort of type hinting to tell you what your array looks like, what it should look like, great. PHP stan or something will tell me, hey, my array doesn't look like that. But like, how do you actually set that? Again, you can do some filtering, but really PHP isn't stopping what the array looks like, right? Like, you don't actually, other than you can't, like, for an array, like that's where you would set a object and you say it's this type of object, so it always has to look like this.
So I asked one of our favorite tools to just invent an answer for us, and the answer that it gave was checking to see if all the values in an array were greater than 10. And I think that's still kind of an academic example in there, because I can't think of a case where I'd want to use that.
Well, for example, let's say we want to pull, we have a, everybody is, we need adults. Hey, we need people over 21 to go out drinking with us after Cascadia PHP, and so we want to know that. There you go. You have got a number limit. So even though they're all integers for the age, maybe we need, something else to tell you it's not just an integer, but it actually has to be above this or more detailed than just the type of it's a string or an integer. Yeah, but tell me more about that string or an integer. The string has to look a certain way, or it has to equal a certain thing, that type of, a little bit more detailed, but you don't have to set an object for it.
I think as long as you can define the behavior of a callback, it'll give you a very quick go, no go.
Mm-hmm. I think it could definitely be one of those ones where you're like, you use it and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, yeah, I could use this here and I could use it there. It's kind of like you get used to, you were mentioning name parameters until you start using name parameters. You're like, what do we need name parameters for? I've always done it this way. It's fine. And then you're like, name parameters? Where have you been all my life?
Yeah, I find it annoying now in other languages when I don't have the equivalent of that.
Yeah, I used it first in Python and I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I was excited for PHP to get it, for sure.
Yeah, my most recent frustration was in TypeScript. I was like, oh, I need to go create an interface with a bunch of nullable properties on it just to be able to enforce that. And so yeah, let's reconvene in like a year or two, and we'll go back over these slides and see what we thought was great and what wasn't.
That would be a fun thing to do. Like over the last, what came out in 2023 and what did you use in 2024, or something like that. Would be fun to see like what actually gets used, because we get ideas and we're like, ooh, I think that would be the best thing ever, and then did it really actually get used? And then there's other things that you're like, eh, and then you're like, all of a sudden you use it and you're like, wow, that's way better than I expected it to be. So it would be interesting to see those kinds of things.
All right, coming soon to Emerge PHP near you.
That's right. It'll be nothing but deprecation or deprecated annotations.
Yeah. All right. Well, if we've got nothing else.
Yeah, I think we're good. If any of you were if anybody was at Cascadia, please fill out the form. You should have gotten in an email. Give us your feedback on what we can do. We share that around with other places too. So even if Cascadia doesn't happen, I'm not promising anything yet, but it's definitely something we'll share with other organizers as well. So please share feedback on that. And don't forget, Tim mentioned at the beginning that some other conferences are coming up, especially tech coming up in May. CFP is open through tomorrow, so submit a talk, please. As someone who had to go through talks, people are not submitting as much right now, so please submit your talks so we can build a better schedule for everyone attending. So submit some talks at tech, and then come to tech in May.
And you can practice your talks at your local PHP user group. And you can also submit those talks here too.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get, since Eric's local to Portland, I'm hoping we're going to have an in-person meetup. I'm a little bit nervous. I'm like, can we do an in-person meetup at the library and have decent Wi-Fi so that he can stream?
Well, what happened to Ian? He could tell you all about your wireless connectivity.
But we're going to try for next month to do in-person for Portland. So those of you who are watching from Portland, watch for that to be in person next month. Hopefully Eric will be there. Not that Eric. Although it would be cool if that Eric was there too.
That'd be a lot of fun.
Okay. See y'all next month.
December 12th.
All right. That ends our broadcast day. Cheers, friends.